April 6, 1965, Bogalusa, Louisiana, a small southern city that smelled like pine trees and paper mill smoke, a place where everybody knew who you were and exactly where you were allowed to stand. That night just after dark, a black man named Robert Hicks stood in the front room of his wooden house on East 9th Street. His wife was in the kitchen. His children were in their beds, and out on the road the sound began. Engines, more than one, slow. Men's voices, the crunch of gravel as cars rolled to a stop in front of his home. Headlights cut through the thin curtains. Then he saw them, pickup trucks full of white men, some in regular clothes, some in those ugly white hoods he knew too well. The Klan had come to send a message. They had already warned him. They had already told him to stop letting civil rights workers sleep in his house. They had already told him to stop hosting meetings, stop pushing for black men and women in Bogalusa, to join unions, to register to vote, to demand fair treatment at the big paper mill that dominated the town. He had not stopped, so they came with guns. Picture it for a second. You are in your own home. Your children are in the next room. You know the police are not here to protect you, because the Klan and the police ride together. You hear a man outside shout your name. Then glass shatters. Shots slam into your house. Wood splinters. Your wife screams. Your children cry out. What do? Most of what you have been taught about that era says this. You duck. You pray. You call on nonviolence. You let them shoot. You hope the world will feel sorry for you. But that night in Bogalusa, that is not what happened. That night, Robert Hicks grabbed his rifle. He had been a patient man, a church man, a union man, a husband and father. He had served his country. He had listened to sermons about turning the other cheek. But he also understood something else. God gave him a family to protect, and the Second World War had taught a whole generation of black men exactly how to fight back. So when the bullets started flying into his home, Robert did not just lie on the floor. He returned fire. He fired back into the night, into the direction of those headlights and those trucks. And something happened that almost never gets told in American history. The Klan ran. Those men who had come to terrorize, to kill, to burn, jumped back into their trucks and sped away into the darkness. You were never taught that in school. You were never shown a textbook that said this sentence. When armed black Christians defended their homes in Louisiana, the Ku Klux Klan ran away. You were instead told a softer version, a story where black dignity came only from marching, from singing, from being beaten and never resisting. That is not the whole story. Not even close. What happened on that street in Bogalusa was not an accident. It was not a random moment of courage. It was part of a whole movement of armed black men of faith who decided they would never again let terrorists ride into their towns and do whatever they wanted. They called themselves Deacons for Defense and Justice. Many of them were church deacons, in name church ushers, choir members, veterans. They held Bibles in one hand and shotguns in the other. And for a brief, powerful window in the 1960s, they made the Klan afraid. Almost no one told you their names. Almost no one told you how they organized. Almost no one told you how they protected civil rights workers, including the most famous ones. Almost no one told you that when the cameras showed peaceful marches just out of frame, there were armed black men ready to defend those marchers if the shooting started. Ask yourself this: why is that the part they left out? Why is the story of armed black faith erased, while the story of black suffering is replayed over and over again? Why did they want you to believe your people only won by being beaten, never by standing their ground? Tonight, that ends. By the time you finish this video, you are going to know the names they buried. You are going to know what really happened in towns like Jonesboro and Bogalusa. You are going to see how armed black deacons forced governors, sheriffs, and even the federal government to act. You are going to hear how these men protected children, churches, marches, and even national leaders. And you are going to understand why this story was erased. Because if you knew this, you would never again see yourself as a powerless victim. This is not ancient history. This is your grandparents' time. This is your parents' childhood. If your family has roots in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in North Carolina, some of your elders may have seen this with their own eyes. They may have known a man who kept a Bible by the bed and a rifle by the door. They may have heard the rumors that in this town, the Klan does not ride like they do anywhere else, because here the men shoot back. After this video, you will understand why the wealth gap exists the way it does. You will understand why some communities managed to hold on to their homes and businesses when others were burned to the ground. You will understand how government policy responded when black people were helpless versus when black people organized and armed themselves. And you will not look at police brutality, mass incarceration, or gentrification the same way again. You have been told that the civil rights movement was just about nonviolence, that Dr. King marched, got arrested, got beaten, and somehow America had a change of heart. You have been told that the only acceptable way to seek justice is to suffer quietly and hope that people feel bad enough to help you. But there has always been another tradition, a tradition of righteous self-defense, a tradition of spiritual warriors who said, we will not kill, but we will not let you kill us either. We will not hunt you, but we will not stand here and let you burn our children alive. By the end of this story, you will know three things for sure. First, you will know exactly who the Deacons for Defense and Justice were, how they formed in July of 1964 in a little town called Jonesboro, Louisiana, how they spread to places like Bogalusa, how they operated, how they used their military training from World War II and the Korean War to protect their communities. Second, you will see the pattern of how this country responds when black communities remain unarmed and isolated versus when they organize and protect themselves. And third, you will see how this connects directly to your life right now, to why your family owns or does not own a home, to why your neighborhood looks the way it does, to why there is a gap that never seems to close. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So take a breath. Think about Robert Hicks in that front room. Think about the sound of glass breaking, bullets hitting wood, children screaming. Think about a man who had every reason to be afraid, deciding he would stand. And think about this question. If he had not fired back that night, how many funerals would Bogalusa have had the next day? How many headlines would have said black troublemakers killed in mysterious shooting? How many sermons would have told his wife to forgive and move on? Hold that image. Hold that tension. Because to understand why men like him picked up guns, you need to understand the world they were living in and the system that made violence against black people not just allowed, but expected. Before we talk about the Deacons as an organized force, you need to see the fire that birthed them. In the summer of 1964, the air in northern Louisiana felt heavy, not just from the heat, from fear. Jonesboro was a small town lined with pine trees and dirt roads, where black people had worked, worshipped, and raised families for generations. They had their churches, their fraternal lodges, their little businesses. They had the same deep Southern faith. They also had something else, a white power structure strengthened by the Ku Klux Klan. That year, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. On paper, segregation was over. In reality, nothing changed in Jonesboro. Black citizens who tried to exercise their new rights, who tried to register to vote, who tried to sit where they were not supposed to sit, met the same old response. Threats, night rides, cross burnings, church fires. What made 1964 different was not that the violence started. It was that black men who knew weapons were not willing to sit quietly anymore. In July of that year, a group of black men in Jonesboro gathered by themselves. Not in a church meeting about choir practice, not in a compromise session with white city leaders, a private gathering. Men who had served in the United States military, men who had fought in Europe and in Korea, men who had carried rifles and machine guns in other countries, supposedly for freedom. They had seen combat. They had watched friends die. They had carried bodies. And now they were back home in Louisiana, being told they did not have the right to walk down their own streets after dark. Among them was a man the community knew by a nickname, Chilly Willie. His full name was Ernest Thomas. Beside him was another man, a preacher named Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick. Together with a handful of others, they made a decision. They would form an organization. They would call it Deacons for Defense and Justice. They chose the word deacons on purpose. In the black church, deacons are servants, protectors, men you trust with the keys to the building and the safety of the flock. These men believed that defending their people from terrorists was a holy duty. They were not bragging. They did not announce this on the radio. They did not hold a press conference. They quietly gathered their firearms, shotguns, rifles, pistols, the same weapons many rural families already owned, but this time organized as a unit. They established rules. No one would fire first. No one would use these guns to rob, to threaten, to show off. The guns had one purpose: to defend black people from deadly attacks. They began to patrol. At night, when pickup trucks full of white men roamed through black neighborhoods, someone would be watching. A car with black men inside might follow at a distance. If a church was rumored to be targeted, the deacons would position themselves in the shadows, with rifles ready to fire if flames appeared. When civil rights workers from groups like CORE came into town to help people register to vote, the deacons assigned themselves as silent bodyguards. They stood outside mass meetings. They walked the streets where organizers visited homes. Why was this necessary? Because just months before, in that same region, the Klan had already torched black churches. They had shot into homes. They had beaten and kidnapped black men and women. The local police did nothing. In some cases, they rode with the Klan. If a black pastor called the sheriff because someone burned his church, he might find the same men laughing about it the next day at the gas station. So imagine you are a black veteran in 1964 Jonesboro. You fought in World War II. You wore the uniform. You came home with an honorable discharge. You are told your service matters. But when local terrorists burn down 2 churches in your town, the sheriff shrugs and says he cannot find any suspects. How long do you sit on your hands? How long do you pray without acting? At what point do you remember that God also gave you eyes to see, hands to work, and yes, hands to defend? This is the moment the deacons were born into. Men who had seen war overseas deciding that if war came to their own streets, they would not be easy prey. You might never have heard the names Ernest Thomas and Frederick Kirkpatrick. You might never have heard about Jonesboro, but you have heard about the Freedom Riders, the college kids, the protests. Now you know. Behind some of those protests in the dark back roads stood men with shotguns who made sure those kids made it home. Hold that thought, because the story is about to shift from Jonesboro to a mill town called Bogalusa, where this idea of armed defense would explode into a direct showdown with the Klan, the local police, the state government, and the federal government itself. Before the Klan ever fired into Robert Hicks' house, there were younger people in Bogalusa who had decided they were tired of waiting. In early 1965, civil rights organizers from an organization called CORE came into the city. One of them was a white man named Bill Yates. Another was a white student from Kansas. They were young, idealistic, and determined to test the Civil Rights Act in the Deep South. Bogalusa was dominated by a massive paper mill owned by a powerful company. The mill controlled jobs, housing, politics. The black population made up nearly half the city, but they were locked out of decent jobs, pushed into the lowest paid positions, denied promotions. They could work in the mill, but not at the better paying levels. They could shop in certain stores, but they knew where they were not welcome. When these young organizers arrived, they began pushing for desegregation and fair hiring. As they did, the Klan took notice. In April 1965, students from Kansas State University traveled to Bogalusa to help register black residents to vote and to support protests. These were kids from far away, raised on the idea of American democracy, now walking into a town where democracy stopped at the city limits for anyone whose skin was dark. They joined local activists in holding classes and meetings in a union hall in the black neighborhood. The Klan responded in their usual way. One night, a caravan of trucks pulled up outside that union hall. Inside, people were learning how to read registration forms, how to navigate the system. Outside, 50 or more white men stood in the dark, some masked. They walked up to the building and left something on the porch. 2 wooden coffins. On one coffin, they painted a name, Bill Yates, a not-so-subtle death threat. Can you feel that? You are a young activist from out of state. You came to help people sign a piece of paper. Now your name is written on a coffin outside the building where you have been teaching. This is not just intimidation. This is a promise. Leave or die. The Klan did not stop there. That same night, they drove through black neighborhoods, firing shots, yelling threats, making sure everyone knew who ruled Bogalusa after dark. The police did not stop them. No one arrested them for making death threats. The city official response was silence. But Bogalusa was not Jonesboro. Bogalusa already had men thinking like the Deacons, men who were tired of watching their community live in fear. Men like A.Z. Young, who had formed the Bogalusa Voters and Civic League to push for rights. Men like Charles Sims, a veteran with a sharp mind and strong backbone. And of course, men like Robert Hicks. They watched the Klan escalate. They watched death threats become open violence. They knew that simply marching and singing was not going to make the Klan back down. So they organized their own chapter of the Deacons for Defense and Justice. This was not a loose group of brothers with guns under the bed. This was disciplined, structured. They chose leadership. Charles Sims became the president of the Bogalusa chapter. Robert Hicks served as a key leader. A.Z. Young continued his work with the Civic League and coordinated political strategy. Together, they created a system of protection for their people. They set up patrols in black neighborhoods. If a suspicious truck rolled through after dark, someone would spot it and radio others. They used walkie-talkies cars and old military habits. They made sure civil rights workers had armed escorts when they walked through certain streets. They did not go around boasting. They did not pose for pictures with guns. They made it known quietly. If you come here with hate in your heart and a weapon in your hand, you will not leave untouched. Which brings us back to that night in early April, when the Klan finally decided to take the fight directly to Robert Hicks' front door. They had already left coffins at the Union Hall. They had already threatened organizers. Now they wanted to prove they could fire into a black leader's house, and no one would stop them. They miscalculated. They did not know that this time the bullets would come back in their direction. When Hicks fired back, it was not just about his home. It was a turning point. Word spread quickly. The Klan did not get an easy victory that night. They had to retreat. For the first time in that town, the idea that black people would not just take it changed the whole balance of fear. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Because once the Deacons began operating openly in Bogalusa, everything around them began to shift. Police behavior, Klan tactics, even the attitude of the state government and the federal government. Armed black men of faith changed the political equation. Before we unfold the full story of that showdown, pause for a moment and let this sink in. For most of your life, you have heard one type of civil rights story: brave nonviolent protesters, brutal white mobs, courageous speeches, tragic deaths, occasional victories in court. You have almost never heard about armed black defenders forcing the Klan to run, forcing police to think twice, forcing a governor to send state troopers to protect black citizens, not out of mercy, but out of fear of what would happen if he did not. Once you see that side of the story, you can never again accept the lie that black people only won by suffering. You will know that they also won by fighting smart, by organizing, by being willing to protect themselves, and by trusting that God is not only in the tears, but also in the courage to stand. Now that you have met the moment and the mood, it is time to meet the men in more detail. Because this is not just about one dramatic night. This is about a generation of black veterans and churchmen who decided they were done letting terrorists set the rules. You need to know their names. You need to see how they grew up. You need to understand what broke them, what pushed them from patience to action. And when you see their lives, you may start to see your own family in them. So let us step closer and walk into their world. The first thing to understand about the Deacons is simple. These were not gang members. These were not hot-headed young men looking for a fight. They were grown men, many in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. They had families. They had steady jobs where they could get them. They had seen death before wearing United States uniforms in foreign lands. There is a big difference between a man who has never touched a gun and a man who has carried one across a battlefield. Take Charles Sims, for example. He would become the president of the Bogalusa Deacons chapter. Sims was a veteran, serious, organized, and deeply respected. He understood discipline. He did not want wild shooting in the streets. He wanted controlled, strategic defense. Under his leadership, the Deacons developed rules the way soldiers have rules of engagement. They used their firearms only when necessary, and they used them well. Then there was A.Z. Young. He was not just a man with a gun. He was a political organizer. He formed the Bogalusa Voters and Civic League, pushing for registration drives, protests, and negotiations with white authorities. Many times his home and life were threatened, yet he kept going. He understood that guns alone could not win. You needed votes, legal cases, and public pressure. The genius of Bogalusa was that the Deacons and the Civic League worked side by side. And of course, there was Robert Hicks, whom you have already met in that front room, with bullets coming through his walls. Hicks was not only a man who could shoot, he was a union activist at the Crown Zellerbach paper mill. He pushed for black workers to get the same opportunities, the same training, the same promotions as white workers. That made him a target even before the Klan focused on him. He was on the front line at work and at home. Back in Jonesboro, the original Deacons chapter had its own core leaders. Ernest Chili Willie Thomas was a nickname that reflected warmth, but there was nothing soft about his resolve. He saw how the Klan burned black churches and how law enforcement looked away. Then there was Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, a minister who believed that faith without works is dead, and that protecting your people is holy work. Put these men together in your mind: veterans, preachers, union men, civic organizers, husbands, fathers, deacons. They were not perfect. They were human. They got tired. They got scared. But they made a common decision. We are not going to let our people be slaughtered while we stand and watch. Imagine what it felt like to be a child in those communities. To see your father put on his Sunday suit to go to church in the morning, and then see him cleaning a shotgun at night. To hear him say grace over dinner, thanking God for food on the table. Then hear him tell the younger boys quietly, "If you hear that truck at night, stay away from the windows, get down on the floor, and do not panic." To watch the men whisper and organize, to know something was changing. That change did not stay quiet very long. As the Deacons began to operate more boldly, powerful institutions took notice. Local white leaders were shocked that black men would dare to arm themselves. Law enforcement realized that this was not the same old terror game. Federal officials began to hear reports that in at least one Louisiana town, black men were not only marching, they were standing guard with guns. And this is where the story takes its next sharp turn. Because when the Deacons stepped into the open in Bogalusa, and when their presence collided with national civil rights organizations and federal law, everything moved to another level of tension and possibility. But before we jump into that major showdown, there is one more thing you need to understand. This story is not just about guns, it is about faith. These men were not simply armed, they were praying men, singing men. Men who sat in pews on Sunday morning, listened to the word, and then went out into a world where the same men who wore choir robes by day put on hoods by night. They wrestled with the same scriptures you know. Turn the other cheek, love your enemies, trust in the Lord. They also knew the passages that talk about watchmen on the wall, about building with one hand and holding a weapon with the other, about shepherds protecting sheep from wolves. They did not see self-defense as a betrayal of their faith. They saw it as an expression of it. Hold that tension in your spirit, because when we walk into the next part of this journey, the question is not just what they did, but why they believed God was with them while they did it. Sections completed. Hook and cold open initial introduction and Stake's early background on Jonesboro and the founding of the Deacons, initial setup of Bogalusa, and key leaders, cumulative word count, approximately 3,100 to 3,400 words, so far out of the 9,000 plus target. Remaining sections, full Bogalusa, confrontation arc, broadened pattern of armed black resistance mechanisms of erasure and suppression, modern wealth gap and systemic racism, connection, empowerment, and identity reframing. 2 mission-driven calls to action and prayer conclusion. The night Robert Hicks fired back was not the end of the story in Bogalusa. It was the beginning of open war over who would rule that city. Terror or justice, fear or courage, tradition or transformation. In the days after that shooting, the mood in the black community shifted. People had been afraid for so long that fear felt normal. You went to work, you went to church, you kept your head down. You hoped the Klan would pick someone else. But once word spread that Robert and the other men did not just drop to the floor when the bullets came, something inside, people woke up. They saw that the men in hoods were not invincible. They could be resisted. They could be forced to back off. The Klan felt that too. And if you know anything about bullies, you know what happens when a bully gets hit in the mouth for the first time. He either backs off or he comes back harder. In Bogalusa, they tried to come back harder. Over the next weeks, Klan caravans continued to drive through black neighborhoods. They followed civil rights workers in their cars. They loitered near union halls and church meetings watching. They wanted to show that one embarrassing retreat did not mean they had lost control. They still had allies in the police department. They still had friends in City Hall. They still had the sense that the law was on their side. But there was a new ingredient in the mix. The Deacons were now fully active in Bogalusa. Charles Sims and his men began to move with even more coordination. They did not just respond when shots were fired. They started to anticipate. Picture a tight little grid of streets on the black side of town. Wooden homes, porches with creaking steps, children playing in yards. At the edge of that neighborhood, men in cars park quietly at dusk. They are not drinking. They are not joking loudly. They sit with the windows cracked, radios off, eyes scanning. They have rifles across their laps. Occasionally, a man steps out, stretches, looks down the road, and gets back in. If they see a truck full of white men rolling slowly down the wrong street, a call goes out. We got visitors. Watch that corner. Be ready. One story passed down from these times describes how deacons would sometimes pull up behind cars of white men who were harassing people. They did not ram them. They did not start a firefight. They just made sure those men could see in their rear-view mirror that they were being followed by black men who were not afraid and not unarmed. Strange how quickly those cars found another route. During daytime marches and pickets, similar patterns unfolded. When local black citizens and outside activists marched to demand fair hiring at the paper mill or to desegregate public facilities, the cameras would film the front lines. People with signs, ministers in suits, college kids in denim and sweat. But behind the marchers, sometimes on the sidewalks, sometimes just out of the main shot, deacons watched. If a hostile crowd gathered, if someone reached into a truck, if a hand went under a seat, they were watching those hands. Now this is where the story hits another critical point. Because the presence of armed black men forced the local government and the federal government to make choices they had never had to make before. When black people were unarmed, officials could let the Klan terrorize them with minimal backlash. When black people were armed and organized, officials knew that if they looked away, the situation could escalate into something they could not control. In the spring and summer of 1965, civil rights workers in Bogalusa were not just dealing with local rednecks. They were dealing with a whole system that believed black people needed to stay in their place. But the deacons understood something fundamental. You cannot negotiate with someone who thinks you are helpless. You only get real negotiations when the other side knows you can hurt them if they cross a line. So the deacons began doing something that shocked even sympathetic outsiders. They showed their guns openly when necessary. There is a story of one march where the Klan threatened to disrupt. The police had done nothing to protect black citizens up to that point. But this time a car with deacons drove up, stepped out, and calmly, in plain view of everybody, opened their trunk, took out shotguns and loaded them where the police could see. Suddenly, the police interest in keeping order increased. Suddenly, the Klan thought twice. This is not fantasy. This is how power works. As long as you appear harmless, your safety depends on the goodwill of people who do not consider you equal. When you show that you can make harm costly, the calculation changes. The tension in Bogalusa kept rising. Civil rights lawyers began paying attention because there was a legal angle here too. The Civil Rights Act was supposed to guarantee equal treatment in public accommodations. Black residents could still not get service in white restaurants. Black union members were still denied equal protection. Black activists were being targeted for violence. At the same time, the city passed ordinances designed to limit protests, restrict marches, control when and where black people could gather. This created a perfect storm. On one side, you had local white power, backed by the Klan and the police. On the other side, you had black citizens, activists, and the deacons standing up not just with signs and hymns, but with organized defense. Above them all, you had state officials in Baton Rouge and federal officials in Washington watching a powder keg. In July of 1965, that powder keg forced them to act. Civil rights lawyers representing the Bogalusa activists filed suit in federal court. They argued that the city and the state were violating the Civil Rights Act and the Constitution by allowing Klan violence, by refusing to protect black citizens, and by harassing civil rights workers. They invoked laws that had been on the books since the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Laws that were supposed to protect freed slaves from organized racist violence. Those laws had been ignored for nearly 100 years. Now, because of what was happening in Bogalusa, federal judges had to dust them off. At the same time, the Department of Justice began sending representatives to observe conditions in Bogalusa firsthand. Imagine being one of those federal officials. You fly from Washington. You arrive in a small Louisiana town. You see white men in trucks with rebel flags. You see Klan symbols. You see black men with guns standing watch over marches. You see a city government either unwilling or unable to enforce the law fairly. The pressure on the governor of Louisiana, John McKeithen, grew. He could no longer pretend this was just a local dispute. On one side, the optics were terrible. Klan mobs, shots into black homes, coffins left on porches. On the other, the idea of armed black men challenging white terrorism was terrifying to the white political establishment. Something had to give. McKeithen chose a middle path. He sent in state police. For the first time, state troopers arrived in Bogalusa with orders to maintain order and to protect civil rights workers. On paper, this looked like the state finally stepping up. In reality, the only reason this happened was because the Deacons had made it clear that if the state did not protect black citizens from the Klan, black citizens would protect themselves. This is crucial. The Deacons forced the hand of the state. They did not achieve this by pleading for mercy. They did it by creating a reality where doing nothing would mean open armed conflict in the streets. The governor did not want a bloodbath on his watch. Neither did the federal government. So they intervened. They negotiated. They sued. They leaned on local officials. Over time, this pressure produced concrete wins. Bogalusa began to desegregate facilities. The paper mill grudgingly opened up some jobs to black workers at higher levels. The Klan, realizing that their free ride had ended, became less bold. They could not ride at night with the same arrogance when they knew Deacons were watching. You see the pattern yet. It was not suffering alone that produced change. It was suffering plus resistance, prayer plus preparation, hymns plus hardware. If you are listening to this and thinking, wait, I never heard about any of this in school, that is not an accident. You are not supposed to know that armed black men of faith forced a governor to call in state police to protect black citizens. You are not supposed to know that federal judges used laws written after slavery to respond to present-day Klan terror pushed by black communities that were not afraid anymore. So let us widen the lens, because the Deacons did not only exist in Bogalusa and Jonesboro, and armed black resistance did not start in 1964. There is a pattern across the South and across decades that shows something simple and powerful. Every time black communities organized and defended themselves, white terror backed up. Every time black communities were unprotected, white terror moved in. Take Monroe, North Carolina in the late 1950s. This was not Louisiana, but the same script played out. A black man named Robert F. Williams led the local NAACP chapter there. He was a veteran too. He had seen what the Klan could do, and he had seen what the law would not do. Williams watched while black women were harassed and assaulted at a local swimming pool. He saw black veterans insulted and beaten. He saw courts let white attackers walk free. So he and other black men started training for defense. They formed a rifle club under the National Rifle Association. They practiced shooting. They established protocols. When the Klan tried to ride into black neighborhoods in Monroe, they did not find helpless families huddling in the dark. They found rifle fire. They found men who knew exactly what they were doing. There is a famous moment when the Klan gathered in cars to attack a house, and Williams and his men opened fire from inside. The Klan fled, not because they had a change of heart, but because getting shot at will change your mind fast. For taking this stand, Williams became a target of the federal government. He was painted as dangerous, extreme a threat to the nonviolent image of the movement. He was forced into exile, but his example remained. Later groups like the Black Panther Party would look back at Monroe and say here is an early model of armed self-defense. Meanwhile, in places like rural Mississippi and Alabama, black families for generations kept guns in their homes as a matter of survival. Civil rights workers who went into those communities in the 60s often wrote later that they were surprised by how many older black men and women kept rifles on the wall, shotguns behind doors, pistols by the bed. They were not formal deacons. They were not in official clubs. But they understood the same thing. If the night riders come, we will not just lie here. Organizers like Fannie Lou Hamer spoke openly about sleeping with a gun near her bed after being beaten, jailed, and nearly killed for trying to vote. Another man, Hartman Turnbow, once famously returned fire when night riders tried to burn his house and kill his family. These people did not think of themselves as radicals. They thought of themselves as parents and Christians who refused to let the devil take over their homes. Do you notice something? Wherever black people were completely disarmed and alone, the worst massacres happened. Tulsa, Rosewood, Elaine. Places where mobs knew they could descend en masse and face little immediate resistance. But in towns and neighborhoods where black men had guns, knew how to use them, and were willing to stand together, the story shifted. Lynching attempts failed. Churches survived. Marchers lived to march again. Here is why that matters now. Because the system you live in wants you to remember the images of attack dogs and fire hoses and unarmed protesters being beaten, but wants you to forget the images of armed black men silently standing near those same marches, making sure the beatings did not become mass killings. The message they want you to internalize is this: your power comes from your ability to suffer. The message your ancestors lived was different. Your power comes from your ability to stand. We are going to talk in coming minutes about how this whole armed side of the story was erased from textbooks, sermons, and mainstream documentaries. We are going to dive into why movement leaders sometimes publicly criticize the Deacons while privately welcoming their protection. We are going to connect all this to why you see the wealth gap you do today, and why the fight for reparations is not some abstract political talking point, but a direct extension of what men like the Deacons died for. But before we go there, this is a good place for a pause and a gut check. If what you have heard so far has hit you in the chest, if something inside you is saying, "How did I not know this?" If you feel a mix of anger, pride, and maybe even grief, then you are awake to the power of this truth. Right now, if this is landing with you, do something simple that actually matters. Drop the word truth in the comments, not for the algorithm, but as a personal declaration. I see it now. I know more of the story. I will not go back to sleep. If you are tired of being fed half a history and watching your people always shown as victims and never as warriors, tap that like button. Not just because it helps this video, but because it sends a signal that this kind of content matters. That these forgotten names and stories deserve to be heard. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this, share it. Send it to a friend from church, to a cousin who loves history, to an elder who lived through this time, but maybe never told you the details. Use this moment as a bridge. Ask them, did you know about the Deacons? Did you ever meet a man like that? What did you see? Because here is the truth. The more we tell these stories, the weaker the lie becomes. The lie that says you were always powerless. The lie that says only suffering is holy. The lie that says America gave you freedom out of kindness, instead of being forced to stop killing you because you would not lie down anymore. We are not even halfway through what you need to hear. The most shocking part is still ahead. We are going to step into how this armed faith tradition got scrubbed out of your education, why it matters for your wallet today, and how your spiritual identity changes when you know your ancestors did more than just sing. They stood with rifles and said, "Not tonight." So now we come to one of the most important questions in this entire story. If what the Deacons did was so effective, if armed black men protecting their communities forced the government to act, forced the Klan to back down, and produced real results, why did almost no one teach you this? Why is the image of the civil rights movement in every textbook a man being beaten while he kneels, and not a man with a rifle standing watch over his church? The answer is not complicated. It is just ugly. They erased this story on purpose. They buried it layer by layer. They did it through what you read in school, through what was filmed and what was not through, which voices got amplified and which got silenced, and through the legal system that criminalized black self-defense while excusing white terrorism. Let us walk through how that erasure worked, because once you see the machinery of it, you will understand why so much of your history feels incomplete. Start with education. The textbooks you grew up with, the ones your children are reading now, have a very clear version of the civil rights movement. There are heroes: Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, maybe John Lewis. There are villains: Bull Connor, Governor Wallace, angry mobs. There is a moral arc. Black people suffered with dignity. White America eventually felt guilty. Laws changed. Justice won. That story is not entirely false, but it is painfully incomplete. It leaves out the entire armed tradition. It leaves out men like the Deacons. It leaves out Robert Williams in Monroe. It leaves out the countless families in Mississippi who kept guns by their doors. Why? Because the story of nonviolent suffering is comfortable for white America. It allows people to feel sympathy without feeling threatened. It allows them to celebrate change without confronting the fact that change came because people were willing to resist, not just endure. If textbooks taught that armed black Christians forced governors to send in state police, if they taught that black men with shotguns made the Klan run, what would that suggest to the next generation? It would suggest that power respects power, that oppressors do not stop because you ask nicely, but because you make oppression costly, that faith and force are not opposites. That is a dangerous lesson if you want to keep people passive. So they removed it. They created a version of history where black heroism means suffering beautifully, and white redemption means eventually doing the right thing. Both sides get to feel good. Black people get to feel proud of their ancestors' dignity. White people get to feel proud that their country overcame its past. No one has to wrestle with the harder truth. That dignity and rifles both played a role. That prayers and patrols walked side by side. Think about how many years you went to school: elementary, middle, high school, maybe college. How many hours did you spend learning about slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights? Now ask yourself, when did anyone tell you that the Second Amendment mattered to black people, not just in theory, but in practice? When did anyone show you a photograph of a black deacon with a Bible and a gun? When did anyone name Charles Sims, or A.Z. Young, or Robert Hicks in the same breath as Martin Luther King? You were not supposed to know those names, because if you knew them, you might start asking uncomfortable questions, like why do we celebrate King but erase the men who kept him alive? Or if armed defense worked in the 60s, why are we told today that black people should never think about defending themselves? The erasure did not just happen in schools, it happened in media. When national news crews came south to film marches and protests, they filmed what made the story easy to tell: brave protesters, violent segregationists, dramatic confrontations. What they did not film or chose not to show were the armed men in the background. producers knew that images of armed black men would complicate the narrative. It would make white audiences nervous. It might make them less sympathetic. So the cameras framed the shots carefully. You see the preacher at the front of the march. You do not see the men flanking the march with rifles under their coats. You see the church where a meeting is held. You do not see the deacons stationed outside after dark. The editing choices were political. They told a story that would win over mainstream white opinion. They left out the parts that might scare or challenge that opinion. There is another layer to this, and it is about language. When white journalists did mention groups like the Deacons, they used very specific words: militant, extremist, armed gang. They did not use the words the Deacons used for themselves: defenders, protectors, veterans, Christians. The framing mattered. If you call someone a militant, the image is of an aggressor. If you call someone a defender, the image is of someone responding to threat. Same actions, completely different moral weight. This pattern continues today. When white men carry guns at protests, they are often called patriots, militias, concerned citizens. When black men carry guns at protests, they are called thugs, gangs, threats to public safety. The language shapes how people see the same behavior. It is not an accident, it is a tool. Then there is the legal side of the suppression. While the Deacons operated in Louisiana, the FBI was watching, not to protect them, to monitor them. Federal agents filed reports on their activities, tracked their membership, and treated them as potential threats to order. Meanwhile, the Klan, an organization that had murdered thousands of black Americans over decades, was investigated far less aggressively. Think about that imbalance. The government knew the Klan was burning churches and killing people. They also knew the Deacons were defending against those attacks. Yet the Deacons got more scrutiny. Why? Because the Deacons represented something the system could not tolerate. Black people taking power into their own hands. Black people saying, "We do not need your permission to protect ourselves." That kind of independence is always seen as more dangerous than white terror, because white terror for most of American history served the interests of the people in charge. There were moments when local police or federal agents would arrest black men for carrying weapons using laws that were never enforced against white men doing the same. There were moments when prosecutors would threaten members of armed defense groups with charges if they continued their activities. The message was clear. We will look the other way when the Klan rides. We will not look the other way when you fight back. Even within the civil rights movement itself, there was tension. National organizations like the NAACP Corps and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference officially supported nonviolence. They had good reasons. They were trying to win over public opinion. They were trying to appeal to the moral conscience of the nation. They believed rightly in some cases that images of peaceful black protesters being brutalized by white mobs would generate sympathy and political pressure. But there was a problem. That strategy only worked if the protesters survived long enough to be seen. And in many places, especially rural areas, far from cameras, survival required more than prayer. It required someone standing watch with a shotgun. So leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. found themselves in a complicated position. Publicly, they preached nonviolence. Privately, they accepted and even appreciated protection from men like the Deacons. There are accounts of King being escorted by armed guards during some of his travels through the Deep South. Those guards were not holding signs, they were holding weapons. King did not advertise it because it would have undermined his message. But he also did not refuse it because he was not foolish. This contradiction reveals something important. The movement was never as purely nonviolent as the mythology suggests. It was a coalition of strategies. Some people marched, some people sat in, some people filed lawsuits, and some people stood guard with rifles, making sure the marchers and the lawyers lived to see another day. All of those roles mattered, but only some of them got remembered. Why does this suppression matter for you today? Because if you do not know the full story of how your ancestors resisted, you cannot fully understand the tools available to you now. If you think the only moral option is to suffer and wait for justice, you will keep waiting forever. If you know that your ancestors combined faith with force, moral clarity with tactical intelligence, prayer with preparation, then you have a much wider range of options when facing modern injustice. The suppression also matters because it affects how you see yourself. If all you know is that black people were victims who needed white saviors or federal intervention, then you internalize a sense of dependence and helplessness. If you know that black people forced intervention by organizing and arming themselves, then you internalize a sense of agency and power. The difference between those two self-images is the difference between a people who beg and a people who demand. And this brings us directly to the question of money, wealth, the gap that defines so much of American life today. Because the story of the Deacons is not just about violence and defense. It is about protecting what was built, about keeping businesses open, about making sure families could stay in their homes, about ensuring that wealth once created was not stolen. So let us talk dollars. Let us talk about what happens when a community can defend itself versus when it cannot. Let us talk about why your family does not own what it should, and let us connect the dots from 1965 Louisiana to your bank account in 2025. Right now, today, the median white household in America has about $188,000 in wealth. Assets minus debts, home equity savings investments. The median black household has about $24,000. That is nearly an 8-to-1 gap. 8 times more wealth, not income. Wealth, the stuff that gets passed down, the stuff that builds over generations. How did that gap get so wide? You have been told a few stories. Black people did not get the same education. Black people faced job discrimination. Black people started from slavery with nothing. All of those things are true. But there is a piece that almost never gets mentioned. Theft. Systematic, organized, legal and illegal theft of black wealth over and over again. Let me give you some examples. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one of the wealthiest black communities in the country. It was called Black Wall Street. Successful businesses, doctors, lawyers, shop owners, families with property. Wealth was being built and passed down. In one night, a white mob with the support of local authorities destroyed it all, burned 35 blocks, killed as many as 300 people. Not a single white person was ever convicted. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. The city changed zoning laws, so black people could not rebuild on their own land. That wealth was never recovered. The descendants of those families should be millionaires today. Instead, they are starting over generation after generation because what their great-grandparents built was stolen and no one ever paid it back. Or take Rosewood, Florida in 1923, a prosperous black town. Families owned land homes, businesses. A white mob inflamed by a false accusation descended on the town. They burned every building. They killed an unknown number of residents. They drove the survivors into the swamps. The town ceased to exist. The land was taken. The wealth vanished. This is not ancient history. People alive today have grandparents who survived these attacks or who did not survive them. Now think about Bogalusa. The Deacons protected that community. When the Klan tried to terrorize, burn, and destroy the Deacons, made it too costly. Businesses stayed open. Homes stayed standing. Families held on to what they had. Not every family became wealthy, because systemic racism still limited opportunity. But they did not lose everything in a single night of terror. You see the difference. In places where black communities were defenseless, wealth was destroyed. In places where black communities defended themselves, wealth had a chance to survive and grow, even if slowly. The Deacons were not just protecting bodies. They were protecting futures. They were protecting inheritances. They were protecting the possibility that the next generation might own something. Fast forward to today. Policies like redlining, which lasted well into the 1960s and 70s, kept black families from buying homes in neighborhoods where property values would rise. Urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century, sometimes called Negro removal, bulldozed thriving black neighborhoods to build highways and developments that benefited white communities. Mass incarceration starting in the 1980s removed black men from their families and communities, breaking economic stability and making it nearly impossible for those men to build wealth after release. At every stage, the pattern is the same. Black people build, the system takes. Black people save, the system taxes, fines, seizes. Black people organize. The system criminalizes, surveils, disrupts. And here is where reparations enters the picture. You have heard people say, slavery was a long time ago, why should we pay for it now? But this is not about slavery alone. This is about 1921. This is about 1965. This is about policies and practices that were in place during your parents' lifetime, maybe during your own lifetime. Robert Hicks, the man you met at the start of this story, lived into the 21st century. He was not an ancient historical figure. He was a real person who survived real terrorism and fought back. The people who shot at his house were never held accountable. The system that allowed them to do it was never dismantled. It just adapted, changed its clothes, put on a new mask. Reparations is not charity. It is repayment. It is taking seriously the idea that when you steal from someone, you owe them what you took plus damages. The Bible says it clearly. If a man steals, he must repay double. Apply that principle here. America stole trillions of dollars in labor-land businesses and lives from black people. By any measure of justice, the debt is real. The argument is not whether something is owed. The argument is whether America has the courage to pay it. And here is the hard truth. That debt will never be paid voluntarily. It will only be paid when black people organize demand and exert power. Just like the Deacons did not get justice by asking nicely. They got it by making it clear that injustice would be resisted. The same principle applies now. Reparations will come when the cost of not paying them becomes greater than the cost of paying them. What does power look like today? It looks like political organization, voting blocks that cannot be ignored, economic boycotts that hurt the bottom line, legal strategies that force courts to face uncomfortable truths. And yes, it looks like the willingness to defend your community, your rights, and your dignity by any means necessary. You are not being asked to pick up a rifle and march into the streets, but you are being asked to recognize that the spirit of the Deacons, the refusal to be passive in the face of injustice, is just as relevant now as it was then. Look at the issues facing black communities today. Police violence. Every few months, another name, another video, another hashtag. How is that different from the Klan riding through town, shooting into houses? The uniforms changed. The impunity stayed the same. Gentrification. Neighborhoods where your family lived for generations are now too expensive for you to afford. Developers buy up property. Rents skyrocket. You are pushed out. How is that different from what happened in Tulsa or Rosewood? The methods are quieter. The result is the same. Displacement, loss of community, loss of wealth. mass incarceration. Black men locked away at rates far higher than anyone else, often for nonviolent offenses, in a system that profits from their labor. How is that different from convict leasing after slavery ended, or from the sharecropping system that trapped families in debt? The chains look different. The bondage is real. Your ancestors fought a version of this system with the tools they had: shotguns, organization, faith, courage. You have access to tools they did not. Information spreads instantly. Movements can organize across the country in hours. Legal precedents exist that did not exist then, but the core lesson remains. You will not be given what you are owed. You must take it, not with violence for its own sake, but with power that cannot be ignored. And power starts with knowledge. Knowing who you are. Knowing what was done to your people. Knowing what your ancestors accomplished. Knowing that you are not the descendant of slaves who only waited for mercy. You are the descendant of warriors who stood up, who shot back when necessary, who protected their own, and who forced this country to change. Let that sink into your bones for a moment. You are not weak. You are not helpless. You are not defined by suffering. You are defined by resistance, by resilience, by a refusal to disappear. That is your inheritance, not poverty, not trauma. Those are things that were done to you. Your inheritance is the strength that survived all of it. When you walk into a room, you carry the DNA of people who beat the Klan. When you speak up for yourself, you carry the voice of people who said no when everyone expected them to stay silent. When you demand what is yours, you carry the same spirit that made Robert Hicks pick up his rifle and defend his family, that made Charles Sims organize men across Louisiana, that made A.Z. Young push for voting rights, even when it meant risking his life. You come from warriors, not because your ancestors wanted war, but because war was brought to them and they refused to surrender. Now I want you to think about how different your life would be if you had learned this in school. If instead of being taught that your people were victims who suffered until white folks decided to help you, had been taught that your people were fighters who forced change. If instead of Black History Month being about pain and sorrow, it was also about strategy and victory. How would that change the way you see yourself? How would that change the way you raise your children? How would that change the way you move through the world? This is not just about pride, though pride matters. This is about power. Because people who believe they are powerless act powerless. People who know they come from power act accordingly. Your ancestors held Bibles in one hand and shotguns in the other. That is not a contradiction. That is wisdom. It is the recognition that God gave you a spirit of power, not of fear. That faith without works is dead. That loving your neighbor does not mean letting your neighbor's oppressor run wild. It means standing between your neighbor and the danger, even if it costs you. There is a verse in Nehemiah that the deacons would have known. When the people of Israel were rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, their enemies threatened to attack. So they worked with one hand and held a weapon in the other. They built and defended at the same time. That is what the deacons did. They built communities, they built movements, they built hope, and they defended all of it from people who wanted to tear it down. You are called to do the same thing today. Build and defend. Build your family's future. Defend it from systems that want to steal it. Build your community's power. Defend it from forces that want to break it. Build your own sense of identity and history. Defend it from lies that want to erase it. This is your mission. Not someday, not when things get easier. Right now, in 2025. In a world that is still trying to figure out whether Black lives actually matter, whether reparations will ever be paid, whether justice is even possible. You are not here by accident. Your ancestors survived Middle Passage slavery, Jim Crow, the Klan, and 1,000 other attempts to destroy them. Why? So you could be here, so you could carry the story forward, so you could be the generation that finally demands and receives what is owed. God did not bring you through all of that for you to live small. God did not preserve your family line through centuries of terror, so you could be quiet and grateful for crumbs. You have a purpose. You have a calling. And part of that calling is to know the truth, to speak the truth, and to live in the power of that truth. The Deacons for Defense and Justice were not perfect. They were human. They made mistakes. They had limits. But they showed a way forward. They showed that faith and force can coexist, that love and strength are not opposites, that protecting your family is holy work, that standing up to evil is what God calls you to do. And they won. Not every battle, not forever. But they won enough to matter. They forced the governor to act. They made the Klan retreat. They kept families alive. They protected movements that changed laws. Their example echoes down through the decades to you. So here is what you do next. First, you subscribe to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because there are hundreds more stories like this one that you have never been told. Stories of Black resistance, Black genius, Black power. Stories that will change how you see yourself and your people. Do not let them bury these truths again. Subscribe so you never miss one. Second, you tell this story to someone else. Tonight or tomorrow, sit down with your children, your grandchildren, your younger family members, and tell them about the Deacons. Tell them about Robert Hicks and Charles Sims and A.Z. Young. Tell them that their ancestors were not just slaves, but warriors. Not just victims, but victors. Pass it down, because the only way history stays alive is if we keep telling it. Third, you take this to your church. Show this video to your pastor. Ask why this is not taught in Sunday school. Ask why the story of Black faith is always about suffering and never about resistance. Ask why we celebrate Martin Luther King, but forget the men who kept him alive. Push your church to teach the whole truth, because the Black church has always been more than songs and sermons. It has been the backbone of resistance. Let it remember that. Fourth, you organize in your own community. You do not need to form a militia, but you do need to build networks. Know your neighbors. Watch out for each other. Support Black businesses. Support Black political candidates who will fight for reparations and justice. Build the kind of community strength that the Deacons built, so that when the next wave of attacks comes, whether it is economic or social or legal, you are not alone, and you are not defenseless. Fifth, you demand reparations. Write to your representatives. Support organizations pushing for it. Vote for people who take it seriously. Make noise. Do not let them ignore the debt. Do not let them change the subject. Your ancestors were robbed. You are owed. Say it loud and say it often. And finally, you live like you know who you are. You walk into rooms with your head up. You speak with the confidence of someone who comes from warriors. You refuse to shrink. You refuse to apologize for existing, for demanding, for taking up space. You are a descendant of the Deacons. That means something. Live like it. This is not about violence. This is about power. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. This is not about hating anyone. This is about loving your people enough to fight for them. The Deacons did not fight because they hated white people. They fought because they loved Black people. They loved their families. They loved their communities. They loved their God. And that love made them strong enough to stand. You have that same love in you. Let it make you strong. Let us pray. Father God, creator of heaven and earth, we come to you tonight with hearts full of gratitude and fire. We thank you for preserving the story of the Deacons for Defense and Justice. We thank you for men like Robert Hicks, who stood in his doorway and said, "Not here, not tonight." We thank you for Charles Sims, for A.Z. Young, for Ernest Thomas, for Frederick Kirkpatrick, and for every man whose name we do not know, but whose courage we inherit. We thank you, Lord, for the warrior blood that runs through our veins, for ancestors who refused to bow, who refused to break, who held Bibles and rifles, and knew that both were tools in your hands. We pray for justice, Lord, justice for every burned church, every stolen acre, every murdered ancestor. We pray for the restoration of what was taken, not because we are greedy, but because your word says that what is stolen must be repaid. We claim that promise tonight. We pray for awakening, God. Let every person who hears this story wake up to who they really are. Not victims, not beggars, but warriors, descendants of people who beat the Klan, inheritors of strength, courage, faith, and power. We pray for our young people, Lord. Protect them from the lies. Teach them the truth. Let them know that they come from greatness. Let them walk in that greatness every day of their lives. We pray for our elders, God. Bless them. Honor them. Let them know that their sacrifices were not in vain, that we remember, that we carry the torch forward. Bless those who seek truth, Lord. Strengthen those who resist erasure. Vindicate the memory of those who died standing. And give us courage. Courage to tell the hard stories. Courage to demand what is ours. Courage to defend our communities. Courage to combine faith with action, prayer with power, hymns with resistance. For you are a God of justice, not just mercy. You are a God of war, not just peace. You fight for your people when they rise. And tonight, we rise. In faith, in power, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. Remember the deacons. You are not descended from people who waited to be saved. You are descended from people who saved themselves, who defended their families, who faced down terror and made it run. You are not weak. You are not helpless. You are not a victim. You are a warrior. You are powerful. You are owed. And you are not going to be quiet about it anymore. This is Dark History Stories. This is where the truth that was buried gets dug up. This is where the names that were erased get spoken again. This is where you learn who you really are. Until next time, build wealth, demand reparations, organize your people, teach your children, and never forget that your ancestors held Bibles in one hand and shotguns in the other, and they won. If they could beat the Klan in 1965, Louisiana, you can overcome anything in 2025. You are free. You are powerful. You are descendants of deacons. Now go live like it. Peace.